Metformin is one of the most prescribed drugs in America. Over 90 million prescriptions filled last year alone. Millions of seniors take it every single day, folding it into their morning routine the way they fold in coffee and a multivitamin without a second thought. Most assume it is safe because it is common. That assumption can be costly. Here is what your doctor may not have time to tell you. After age 60, your body processes food and medication differently. The rules change. What worked at 45 does not work the same at 65. The metabolism slows. The organs that filter and clear medication are operating on a different timeline than they were 2 decades ago. And certain combinations, food and metformin together, carry documented, evidence-based risks that most people have never heard of. Risks that are not theoretical, not rare edge cases, but patterns showing up in clinical data and prescribing guidelines right now. So how did something so widely trusted end up at the center of so much confusion and genuine danger? The viral claims spreading online right now are not helping. They name specific foods. They promise a tidy list of 3. They drive clicks and sell supplements. But the real risks are different from what those headlines suggest, and in some ways, more serious, more insidious, and more preventable if you know where to actually look. What follows is evidence-based, sourced from the FDA, the NIH, and Mayo Clinic. No panic, no sales pitch, just the facts you can actually act on, starting with why your age changes everything about how this drug behaves inside your body. You did not wake up one morning and become a different person. It happens slowly, quietly, 1% at a time. Here is the number that matters. Kidney function declines roughly 1% per year after age 40. By the time you reach 60, your kidneys are filtering measurably less than they did 2 decades ago. That is not a disease. That is biology. But it has consequences that most people taking metformin are never told about. Consequences that accumulate in the background while the prescription gets refilled month after month without a second look. Metformin is cleared almost entirely by the kidneys. When filtration slows, the drug clears more slowly. That means higher concentrations building in the bloodstream, not because the dose changed, but because the body changed. The same pill, a different result, the same label on the bottle, a different pharmacological reality inside the person swallowing it, and the kidneys are only part of the story. Stomach acid production drops with age. That affects how nutrients and drugs are absorbed together, which matters enormously when food and metformin share the same digestive window. The timing of absorption shifts. The concentration curve changes. What used to be a predictable, manageable peak in the bloodstream becomes something less predictable, more variable, harder to manage without updated monitoring. Liver efficiency decreases too. The liver's capacity to buffer metabolic stress from drug-food combinations is simply not what it was at 40. The organ is still functioning. It is just functioning with less reserve, less margin for error, less ability to compensate when 2 competing demands arrive at the same time. These changes are normal. They are not alarming on their own, but they demand awareness. They demand that the conversation about metformin safety be updated, not frozen. At the moment the prescription was first written years ago, not locked into the assumptions of a body that has since changed in ways the original dosing did not account for. This is the foundation everything else rests on. And once you understand it, the real risks stop being abstract. They become specific, actionable, and in some cases, urgent. Online, the headline appears in a thumbnail, bold red text, a warning. Never take metformin with these 3 common foods after 60. Millions of seniors see it. Thousands click. The video loads, and within the first 30 seconds, the viewer is told they are in danger. That 3 specific everyday foods are silently making their medication toxic. The production is polished. The narrator sounds authoritative. The graphics are alarming in exactly the right way to keep a worried 68-year-old watching until the end. A clock ticks in the background of the audio mix. A heartbeat sound effect pulses beneath the narration. The visual cuts are fast, urgent, designed to keep the nervous system slightly off balance. The color grading is deliberately cool and clinical, all blue-gray tones, the visual language of a hospital corridor chosen to signal danger without stating it directly. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because the claim is not supported by verified clinical evidence. Not from the FDA, not from the Mayo Clinic, not from the NIH. None of these institutions, the most authoritative medical sources available to American patients, identify a specific trio of common foods that are uniquely and categorically dangerous when combined with metformin after age 60. The list does not exist in peer-reviewed literature. It does not appear in prescribing guidelines. It was not handed down from a clinical trial. It was constructed, assembled from fragments of real science, stripped of context, and packaged into a format designed to generate fear and clicks. If you are wondering how that is even legal, so is everyone else. The mechanics of the claim follow a familiar pattern. Take a real drug, take a real concern, in this case, the legitimate fact that metformin interacts with certain dietary and physiological factors, then compress that nuance into a numbered list. 3 foods, simple, shareable, terrifying. The specificity creates the illusion of expertise. The fear creates the motivation to keep watching or to buy whatever supplement is being promoted in the description below. The viewer finishes the video feeling informed. They are not informed, they are redirected. They close the tab with a sense of resolution that is entirely manufactured, a feeling of having learned something that is actually the sensation of having been steered somewhere profitable. And here is what makes it genuinely dangerous, not the foods on the list itself. When patients believe the risk is confined to 3 named items, they stop looking for the real risks. They avoid grapefruit or whatever food the video named that week, and they feel protected. They do not ask their doctor about their kidney function and how it affects drug clearance. They do not think carefully about their alcohol intake. They do not know to watch for the symptoms of vitamin B12 depletion, a documented, well-established consequence of long-term metformin use that builds silently over months and years, eroding nerve function and cognitive clarity while the patient attributes the symptoms to aging. Misinformation about medication is not just annoying, it redirects attention. It fills the space where accurate, actionable knowledge should live. It gives patients a false sense of security that is, in some ways, more dangerous than no information at all. The irony is that real risks do exist. Documented ones. Ones that the FDA and clinical researchers have studied carefully. But they are not a tidy list of 3 forbidden foods. They are patterns, dietary habits, physiological conditions, and combinations that interact with metformin in ways that are measurable and, in some cases, serious. Consider what the NIH's own published data shows about metformin and lactic acidosis, a rare but serious condition where lactic acid builds up in the blood faster than the body can clear it. The risk is not triggered by eating a specific food. It is triggered by conditions that impair kidney clearance, dehydration, certain medications, contrast dyes used in medical imaging, and yes, alcohol. These are not foods in the viral thumbnail sense. They are physiological contexts, and they matter far more than any list of 3. The Mayo Clinic's guidance on metformin is similarly grounded. It does not name 3 forbidden foods. It emphasizes kidney function monitoring, hydration, and awareness of drug interactions. It treats patients as adults capable of understanding nuance, which is exactly what the viral content refuses to do. Everything the viral claim had built, its authority, its specificity, its promise of simple safety, was about to work against the very people it claimed to protect. Because the real conversation about metformin and food after 60 is not about 3 items on a list. It is about 3 categories of genuine documented risk. And the first one involves something that millions of seniors consume regularly, often without thinking twice about how it interacts with the medication sitting on their nightstand. The kitchen counter, 7 in the evening, a glass of wine beside a weekly pill organizer, the kind with the days of the week printed in faded letters across the top. The dinner dishes are drying in the rack. The television is on in the other room. A retired teacher in Phoenix, a grandfather in Tampa, a widow in Cleveland. They have taken their metformin, they are unwinding after dinner, they pour a second glass, and somewhere in the background, a metabolic clock begins ticking. This is not a story about alcoholism. This is a story about something far more ordinary and far more dangerous because of that ordinariness. Here is what the prescription label does not tell you in plain language. Metformin and alcohol share a common target, the liver. Metformin works partly by signaling the liver to reduce its glucose output. It places a metabolic demand on that organ every single day, a demand that is manageable under normal circumstances, but that does not disappear when other demands arrive. Alcohol, meanwhile, requires the liver to break it down, process it, and clear it from the bloodstream. 2 demands. 1 organ. And after 60, that organ is already working with reduced capacity, reduced enzyme activity, reduced margin for simultaneous stress. The liver of a 65-year-old processes alcohol measurably more slowly than it did at 35. The science on this is not disputed. Blood alcohol levels stay elevated longer. The window of metabolic stress is wider, and inside that window, something called lactic acid begins to accumulate. Under normal circumstances, the body clears lactic acid efficiently. It is a byproduct of energy metabolism, and healthy liver function keeps it in check, cycling it back through metabolic pathways before it reaches dangerous concentrations. But when metformin is present and alcohol is stressing the liver simultaneously, that clearance mechanism slows down. The liver is being asked to manage glucose signaling, process ethanol, and cycle lactic acid all at once. In a younger body with full enzymatic reserve, that juggling act is demanding but survivable. In a body past 60, with enzyme activity already running at a reduced baseline, the math changes. Lactic acid builds. And if it builds fast enough and high enough, the result is a condition called lactic acidosis. Lactic acidosis is rare. That fact is important, and it is also the fact that makes this risk so easy to dismiss. Rare does not mean impossible. Rare does not mean survivable without intervention. And rare does not mean the warning on the package insert is there for decoration. It means the warning is there because the condition is real, because it has happened, and because the circumstances that produce it are more common than most patients realize. The symptoms are deceptive: muscle pain, unusual weakness, trouble breathing, stomach discomfort, feeling cold, a general sense that something is wrong without a clear explanation for what. These are symptoms that a 68-year-old might attribute to a bad night's sleep, a pulled muscle, or simply getting older. The retired teacher in Phoenix described it later as feeling like the flu without the fever. The grandfather in Tampa thought he had overdone it in the yard. He had spent the afternoon pulling weeds in 90-degree heat, and when the weakness arrived in his arms and the nausea settled into his stomach around 9 that evening, he sat down in his recliner and waited for it to pass. Neither of them connected what they felt to the glass of wine they had poured 2 hours after taking their evening metformin. That is the trap. The body is sending a signal, and the signal looks like noise. And that was not even the part that got people angry. What got people angry when this risk started receiving more clinical attention was the realization that patients had never been told. Not in a meaningful way, not in a way that connected the glass of wine at dinner to the pill taken an hour earlier. The information existed in medical literature. It existed in prescribing guidelines. It simply did not make it to the kitchen counter in Phoenix, or Tampa, or Cleveland. It stayed in the chart, in the fine print, in the language of clinical pharmacology that does not translate itself into plain speech without someone choosing to do that translation. The conversation that should happen, and often does not, is straightforward. If you are over 60 and taking metformin, any alcohol consumption, including moderate social drinking, including a single glass of wine with dinner, warrants a direct conversation with your prescribing physician. Not because one drink will certainly cause lactic acidosis, but because the combined metabolic load on an aging liver is a variable your doctor needs to factor into your care. Full stop. The retired teacher in Phoenix eventually had that conversation. Her doctor reviewed her kidney function numbers, looked at her current dose, and adjusted her guidance based on where her health actually stood, not where it had stood when the prescription was first written 4 years earlier. She did not stop drinking entirely. She made an informed decision with complete information. That is what this is supposed to look like. That is the outcome that becomes possible when the real risk replaces the viral list. The glass of wine beside the pill organizer would come back to haunt patients who never got that conversation. But that is getting ahead of the story. A breakfast table, 8 in the morning, a bowl of sweetened cereal, a glass of orange juice, and a Metformin tablet washed down with the last swallow. The spoon clicks against the ceramic. The morning news plays quietly on the counter. The cereal box faces outward, its label promising whole grain goodness in letters large enough to read from across the kitchen. It is a routine so established it requires no thought. That is exactly the problem. The medication enters the bloodstream, it begins its work, and simultaneously, 60 grams of sugar from that breakfast begin their own journey through the digestive tract, converting rapidly to glucose, flooding the portal vein, arriving at the liver in a wave that peaks within 30 minutes of the last bite. The race is already lost before it starts. Metformin has a specific, well-documented job. It reduces the amount of glucose the liver releases into the blood. It improves the body's sensitivity to insulin, making cells more receptive to absorbing glucose from the bloodstream. It does not eliminate blood sugar. It manages it, it moderates the peaks, it smooths the curve. That is the mechanism, that is the design. And it is a good design, backed by decades of clinical evidence, when the dietary context gives it something reasonable to work with. But the version you have heard, that is not the full picture. Because what the design assumes is a reasonable incoming load. A dietary pattern that gives the medication something to work with rather than something to fight against. What it does not account for, what it cannot account for, is a constant daily flood of refined carbohydrates arriving faster than any medication can respond. White bread, sugary drinks, pastries, packaged snacks with 15 grams of sugar per serving, and a glycemic index that sends blood glucose vertical within minutes. These are not exotic foods. They are the staples of a convenience diet. They are affordable, accessible, and aggressively marketed to exactly the demographic most likely to be managing type 2 diabetes with metformin. And they cause glucose to spike in the bloodstream within minutes of consumption, far faster than metformin's mechanism can blunt, far faster than insulin response in an aging pancreas can compensate. After 60, the problem compounds in ways that are not always visible in routine checkups. Insulin response slows with age. The pancreas does not release insulin as quickly or as efficiently as it once did. A glucose spike that a 40-year-old body might handle in 90 minutes can persist for 3 hours or more in a 65-year-old body, even with metformin on board, even with the medication doing exactly what it is supposed to do. The drug is not failing. The dietary load is simply too large, arriving too fast for the drug to manage alone. And the timing of what happened next was almost too perfect. Because this is the point where the clinical picture gets genuinely alarming. Prolonged hyperglycemia, blood sugar staying elevated for hours after every meal, is not a benign inconvenience. It is the mechanism through which diabetes causes its most serious long-term damage. Nerve damage, kidney disease, cardiovascular complications, vision loss. These are not abstract risks. They are the documented outcomes of chronically uncontrolled blood glucose, and they develop slowly, quietly, over years, while the patient believes the medication is handling things because they are taking it every single morning without fail. The research on postprandial glucose spikes in older adults on metformin is consistent. The drug's effectiveness is directly undermined by high glycemic dietary patterns. This is not a side effect. This is not an interaction in the traditional sense. This is something more fundamental. It is the defeat of the drug's purpose. The medication is present, the medication is working, and it is losing meal by meal, bowl of cereal by bowl of cereal, to a dietary pattern that was never adjusted when the prescription was written. The key moment arrives not in an emergency room, but in a routine lab result. An A1C that has not improved despite months of medication, a fasting glucose that remains stubbornly elevated, a doctor who increases the metformin dose without asking what the patient ate for breakfast, without asking whether the dietary context has changed, without asking whether the flood is still arriving every morning at 8. The dose goes up, the cereal bowl stays the same, the flood continues. What changed is the trajectory. A patient who might have achieved stable glucose control with dietary adjustment instead moves toward higher medication doses, additional prescriptions, and the downstream complications that follow years of inadequate control. The medication becomes a ceiling, not a floor, a limit on how bad things get rather than a foundation for genuine management. The morning routine that felt like discipline, taking the pill, eating breakfast, heading into the day, was quietly working against the outcome it was supposed to produce. The same breakfast table that built the patient's sense of routine was about to destroy it. But what nobody saw coming was the silent damage already accumulating in the nervous system, one depleted B12 molecule at a time. Metformin's story is not unique among medications that interact with the body's nutritional landscape in ways that take years to become visible. The B12 connection is documented, consistent across multiple studies, and consistently underappreciated in routine care. Long-term metformin use interferes with B12 absorption in the gut. The mechanism involves calcium-dependent receptors in the small intestine that metformin appears to disrupt. The depletion is gradual. It does not announce itself. There is no acute event, no sudden symptom that points clearly to a cause. Instead, the deficiency accumulates over months and years quietly, while the patient continues taking the medication and refilling the prescription and assuming that because nothing dramatic has happened, nothing is wrong. The symptoms arrive slowly enough that they are easy to attribute to aging rather than to a correctable nutritional deficiency sitting quietly beneath the surface. Fatigue that feels heavier than it used to. A tingling in the hands and feet that comes and goes. Moments of mental fogginess that last a little longer each time. Balance that is slightly less reliable on stairs. A handwriting that has grown shakier without any clear explanation. These are the kinds of changes that a 67-year-old mentions to a friend over coffee and then dismisses as just getting older. They are also the early signs of B12 deficiency neuropathy, nerve damage that, if caught early, is reversible, and if missed for long enough, is not. The clinical guidance is clear. Patients on long-term metformin should have their B12 levels monitored regularly. A simple blood test. An inexpensive supplement if levels are low. A straightforward intervention that costs almost nothing and prevents damage that costs enormously. And yet the monitoring is inconsistently applied. The conversation about B12 does not always happen at the annual visit. The patient does not know to ask. The deficiency continues, the nerve damage accumulates. And somewhere in a clinic, a physician is treating the symptoms of something that could have been prevented with a blood test ordered 2 years earlier. The patient is prescribed a medication for the tingling, a second prescription for the fatigue, a third for the sleep disruption the fatigue is causing. The original deficiency, the one sitting at the root of all of it, remains undetected because nobody ordered the test. And always tell your imaging team you take it. Contrast dyes used in CT scans and other imaging procedures can temporarily impair kidney function. In a patient taking metformin, that temporary impairment can be enough to slow drug clearance to dangerous levels. It is a straightforward precaution. It is also one that gets missed when patients do not know to mention it because nobody told them it mattered. The patient checks in for a routine scan. The intake form asks about allergies. Nobody asks about metformin. The contrast dye is administered. The kidneys, already working at reduced capacity, take on the additional burden. The metformin that should have cleared hours ago is still circulating. The risk window opens quietly without alarm, without anyone in the room knowing it is there. standard protocol at many institutions now calls for holding metformin for 48 hours before and after contrast administration. But that protocol only protects the patient who knows to trigger it. The patient who walks in uninformed, who hands over the intake form without mentioning the small white tablet in the Tuesday slot of the pill organizer in their coat pocket, does not get that protection. The gap between the protocol and the patient is a gap that information closes, nothing else. The real story of metformin after 60 is not 3 foods on a thumbnail. It is a body that has changed, a drug that has not adjusted to meet it, and a gap between what the clinical literature knows and what the patient at the kitchen counter has been told. That gap is closable. The conversation is not complicated. It just has to happen. Kidney function checked. B12 levels monitored. Alcohol discussed honestly. Dietary patterns examined with the same seriousness as the prescription itself. Imaging teams informed before the contrast dye is drawn. These are not dramatic interventions. They are the ordinary, unglamorous work of medicine done carefully. The kind of care that does not make a thumbnail, but does make a difference. The virus